Welcome back to Financial Freedom Desk, where we don't just report the news, we decode the patterns that shape your financial future. Today, I'm going to show you something that will fundamentally change how you view America's economic trajectory. What I'm about to reveal isn't speculation. It isn't fear-mongering. It's historical pattern recognition at its most disturbing level. Between 1492 and 1588, Spain went from the world's undisputed superpower to a broken empire that would never recover its former glory. That's just 96 years, less than a single human lifetime. And here's what should keep you up at night. The exact same 5 warning signs that destroyed Spanish dominance are now flashing red in America. Not similar signs, not comparable indicators, the exact same patterns. Stick with me for the next several minutes, because by the end of this analysis, you'll see the American economy through a completely different lens, and more importantly, you'll know exactly what to watch for in the months ahead. Let's start with the first warning sign, and it's the one that most people completely misunderstand. Spain's destruction began with what seemed like the ultimate economic advantage: unlimited silver and gold. When Spanish conquistadors returned from the Americas with ships loaded with precious metals, the Spanish crown thought they had won the economic lottery. The treasure fleets brought so much gold and silver that Spain seemed invincible. They could finance any war, build any palace, fund any expedition. But here's the cruel irony that economists still study today. All that wealth destroyed them. Why? Because the Spanish monarchs made a fatal error. They confused the symbol of wealth with actual wealth creation. They believed that having more gold and silver made them richer, but what it actually did was trigger massive inflation. As more and more precious metals flooded into Spain, prices skyrocketed. One piece of silver suddenly cost 5. The real purchasing power of Spanish currency collapsed even as the vaults overflowed with treasure. The Spanish crown's response: they debased their currency even further, mixing base metals with precious ones, creating coins that looked valuable but weren't. Sound familiar? Now let's jump to America today. Since the year 2000, the United States has expanded its money supply by over 400%. During the COVID pandemic alone, the Federal Reserve created more dollars than existed in the entire first 200 years of American history. We've gone from about $800 billion in circulation in 2008 to over $6 trillion today. That's not economic growth. That's currency debasement on a scale that would make Spanish monarchs blush. And just like Spain, we're told this is necessary, that it makes us stronger, that modern economics is different. But here's what the data actually shows. The purchasing power of the US dollar has declined by 97% since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. Your great-grandparents could buy what costs you $100 today for just $3. That's not inflation, that's currency destruction in slow motion. The parallel gets even more disturbing when you look at how both empires justified their actions. Spain told its people that the influx of precious metals from the New World was evidence of God's favor and Spanish superiority. America tells its citizens that dollar dominance and reserve currency status prove American exceptionalism. Both empires convinced themselves that the rules of economics didn't apply to them. Both believed they could print or import their way to perpetual prosperity. Both were catastrophically wrong. The Spanish discovered that you can't eat gold. Americans are discovering that you can't eat digital zeros in a Federal Reserve computer. Real wealth comes from production, innovation, and goods that people actually need. Everything else is just accounting tricks that eventually catch up with you. Here's the hook you need to understand. When Spain's currency finally collapsed, it didn't happen slowly. There was a tipping point where confidence evaporated almost overnight. Merchants refused Spanish coins. Trading partners demanded payment in other currencies. The empire that had funded armies across Europe suddenly couldn't pay its soldiers. The question isn't whether America will face a similar moment. The question is whether we're already in the early stages and just don't recognize it yet. When central banks around the world start quietly diversifying away from dollar reserves, when oil-producing nations begin accepting payment in other currencies, when your trading partners start negotiating deals that bypass the dollar entirely, these aren't abstract geopolitical events. These are the early tremors before the earthquake. The second warning sign that killed Spain was debt accumulation to finance military operations that produced no economic return. Spain, in the 1500s, was constantly at war. They fought the Ottomans in the Mediterranean. They battled Protestant forces in the Netherlands. They attempted to invade England with the famous Armada. They maintained garrisons across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Every single one of these military adventures required enormous funding, and Spain paid for them the same way empires always do. They borrowed. Spanish kings took out loans from German and Italian banking families at interest rates that sometimes exceeded 20% annually. The crown's revenues from American silver were pledged years in advance to pay back previous debts. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, again in 1560, then 1575, then 1596, and 3 more times in the 1600s. Each time, they wiped out creditors, destroyed trust in Spanish bonds, and made future borrowing even more expensive. But they never stopped fighting wars, and they never stopped borrowing to pay for them. The military adventures that were supposed to make Spain great instead drained the empire of resources that could have built industries, educated citizens, or developed infrastructure. Now let's talk about America's addiction to military spending and debt. The United States currently spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. We maintain over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries around the world. Since 2001, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone have cost American taxpayers over $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Cost of War project. That's trillion with a T. And what did those expenditures produce? What economic value did America receive? The answer, if we're being honest, is essentially nothing. Afghanistan returned to Taliban control. Iraq remains unstable. American influence in the Middle East has arguably declined, not increased. But here's where the Spanish parallel becomes almost eerie in its precision. Just like Spain, America finances these military operations almost entirely with borrowed money. The U.S. national debt now exceeds $34 trillion. That's over 100% of GDP, a threshold that historically precedes economic crisis. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2033, just servicing the interest on this debt will cost more than the entire defense budget. Think about that. We'll be spending more money just on interest payments than we spend on the military that supposedly justifies much of the borrowing in the first place. It's a death spiral of fiscal insanity. And just like Spain, America has convinced itself that this debt doesn't matter because we're special. Spain believed their empire was divinely ordained and would last forever. America believes that because the dollar is the reserve currency, we can borrow indefinitely without consequences. Both empires told themselves that the normal rules of economics didn't apply to them. Both were wrong. Spain discovered that there's a limit to how many times you can default and still expect people to lend to you. America is about to discover that reserve currency status isn't a permanent condition. It's a privilege that can be revoked when creditors lose confidence. Here's the uncomfortable question nobody in Washington wants to answer. What happens when the interest payments on our debt exceed our ability to pay them without printing even more currency? Spain faced that exact scenario, and their solution was to default, debase the currency further, and slide into irreversible decline. America's politicians talk about the debt ceiling as if it's a formality, a political game where we can always just raise the limit and keep borrowing, but there's a real ceiling that no vote can change, the ceiling of creditor confidence. When that breaks, when the world decides that U.S. Treasury bonds aren't the safest investment anymore, the collapse won't be gradual. It will be sudden, severe, and irreversible. The third warning sign is perhaps the most insidious because it happens slowly enough that each generation doesn't notice the decline. Spain, at the height of its power, stopped making things. They imported finished goods from England, France, and the Netherlands while exporting raw materials and precious metals. This seems like a minor issue, but it's actually the economic equivalent of a death sentence. When you stop producing, you become dependent on others for your survival. You lose the skills, the infrastructure, and the knowledge base that made you powerful in the first place. Spanish craftsmen couldn't compete with cheaper foreign goods bought with American silver. Spanish industries withered. The Spanish Inquisition, originally intended to maintain religious unity, became a tool of political repression that drove away some of Spain's most productive citizens, the Jews and Muslims, who had contributed enormously to Spanish commerce, science, and culture. Spain expelled hundreds of thousands of these people, losing their skills, capital, and networks overnight. It was economic self-mutilation in the name of ideological purity. The short-term political gain of appeasing extremists resulted in long-term economic devastation that Spain never recovered from. Now let's talk about America in 2025. Our political system is more polarized than at any point since the Civil War. Democrats and Republicans don't just disagree on policy, they view each other as existential threats to the nation. We can't agree on basic facts, let alone solutions to our problems. Half the country believes the last election was stolen. The other half believes that claim is a dangerous lie. We're not debating tax rates or foreign policy anymore. We're debating whether our democratic institutions are even legitimate. The economic dimension of this divide is equally disturbing. The wealth gap in America now exceeds the inequality levels that preceded the Great Depression. The top 1% of Americans own more wealth than the entire middle class. CEO compensation has increased by over 1,000% since 1978, while worker wages have barely kept pace with inflation. Young Americans are the first generation in modern history expected to be poorer than their parents. This isn't just unfair, it's destabilizing. When the social contract breaks down, when people lose faith that hard work leads to prosperity, societies fracture in dangerous ways. And just like Spain, America is seeing productive people leave or check out entirely. We're experiencing what some economists call internal emigration, people who physically remain in the country but psychologically and economically. Labor force participation rates have declined, entrepreneurship rates have dropped among younger generations, brain drain is accelerating as talented professionals emigrate to countries with better opportunities. The people who could solve our problems are instead concluding that the system is too broken to fix. The regional tensions are intensifying as well. Red states and blue states are implementing radically different policies on everything from education to healthcare to business regulation. We're becoming less of a unified nation and more of a loose federation of incompatible political cultures sharing a currency and military. The federal government increasingly lacks the authority or credibility to impose national solutions. When the next major crisis hits, whether it's economic, military, or environmental, our ability to respond collectively is questionable at best. Here's what history teaches us. Empires don't die from external conquest when they're strong internally. They die when internal divisions make them unable to respond to external challenges. Spain couldn't defend its territory effectively because different regions refused to cooperate or fund common defense. The empire imploded from within long before foreign armies finished it off. America's greatest threat isn't China or Russia. It's our inability to function as a coherent nation when unity becomes necessary for survival. The fifth and final warning sign is the one that seals an empire's fate because it destroys the possibility to reverse course. Spain experienced a catastrophic collapse in education, innovation, and talent development. The Spanish Inquisition created an atmosphere where intellectual curiosity was dangerous. Scientists, thinkers, and innovators either fled to more tolerant countries or kept their ideas hidden. Spanish universities, once world-renowned, became irrelevant as the best minds migrated to England and France. And the Netherlands. The economic impact was devastating. While other European nations entered the scientific revolution and developed new technologies, Spain fell behind. Dutch and English ships became faster and more maneuverable. Foreign manufacturing became more efficient. Agricultural techniques improved everywhere except in Spain. By the time Spanish leaders recognized the problem, they had lost the educational infrastructure and talent base to compete. You can't rebuild a culture of innovation once it's been destroyed. Spain went from a center of learning to an intellectual backwater in just 2 generations. Now let's examine what's happening to American education and talent development. U.S. students now rank 25th in math and 17th in science among developed nations. Our primary and secondary education systems are failing to prepare students for the modern economy. College has become so expensive that it burdens graduates with crippling debt. The average student loan debt is over $30,000, creating a generation that starts their careers in a financial hole. We're telling young people that education is the path to success while simultaneously making it economically crushing to pursue. But the real crisis is in advanced education and research. America's dominance in science and technology was built on attracting the world's best talent. We educated foreign students who then stayed and built American companies. Google, eBay, Tesla, Nvidia, all founded or co-founded by immigrants. But immigration restrictions, political hostility toward foreign talent, and better opportunities elsewhere are reversing this flow. Increasingly, foreign students get their degrees and return home or go to third countries. The brain gain that powered American innovation is becoming a brain drain. The most alarming parallel to Spain is the growing hostility toward expertise and intellectual achievement in American culture. Science has become politicized. Look at what's happening in American universities. Research funding is declining in real terms. Political interference in academic freedom is increasing. The best researchers are being recruited by Chinese institutions, offering better pay and fewer restrictions. We're losing the advantage in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology, the industries that will define the next century. And we're losing them, not because American scientists aren't capable, but because we're creating an environment where innovation is harder and less rewarding than it used to be. Here's the terrifying reality. Technology and innovation are winner-take-all games. The country that leads in AI will dominate the global economy for the next 50 years. Just like the country that led in industrial production dominated the 20th century, Spain fell behind in the technologies that mattered in the 1600s and never caught up. If America falls behind in the technologies that matter in the 2000s, we won't catch up either. And right now, we're not just falling behind. We're actively sabotaging our own advantages through political dysfunction, underinvestment in education, and hostility toward the very experts and institutions that made America dominant in the first place. Now here's where this analysis gets truly frightening. Spain didn't collapse because of any single one of these. Warning signs. Empires are resilient. They can survive currency problems, debt, deindustrialization, social division, or brain drain if they address the issue in time. What killed Spain was the convergence of all 5 warning signs happening simultaneously, creating a feedback loop of decline that became impossible to reverse. Currency debasement made debt worse, debt reduced investment in industry and education. Industrial decline increased social tensions, social fragmentation made it impossible to implement solutions, and the talent drain ensured there was nobody left with the skills to fix the problems. America in 2025 isn't facing 1 or 2 of these challenges, we're facing all 5 at once. And they're reinforcing each other in exactly the same way. They destroyed Spain. Our currency debasement is accelerating, just as our debt becomes unsustainable. Our industrial base is hollowing out while our society fractures along political, economic, and cultural lines. Our educational advantage is eroding while our best talent considers leaving. We're not in the early stages of imperial decline. We're in the middle stages, past the point where simple reforms could fix the problem. The Spanish had about 90 years from their peak to their collapse into irrelevance. Where is America in that timeline? I would argue we're about 50 to 60 years in. The peak of unchallenged American power was probably 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the US stood alone as the global superpower. Since then, we followed the Spanish playbook with eerie precision. Endless wars funded by debt. Financialization, replacing production, growing inequality, political paralysis, and complacency born from the assumption that American dominance is permanent rather than contingent. Here's what makes this moment especially dangerous. Historical cycles are accelerating. What took Spain 90 years to experience might take America 30 or 40, because everything moves faster now. Financial crises cascade globally in days rather than years. Industrial capacity can shift to competitors in a decade rather than a generation. Social media accelerates political polarization. The talent drain happens at the speed of international flights rather than sailing ships. If the Spanish pattern holds, we don't have another 50 years to fix this. We might have 10 or 15 years before the decline becomes irreversible. So what does all this mean for you watching this video right now? First, understand that this isn't a prediction of next month or next year. This is the trajectory we're on, unless something fundamental changes. The patterns are clear, the warning signs are flashing, but the timeline is uncertain. Spain took 90 years to collapse. America might take longer or shorter, depending on decisions made in the next few years. What you need to focus on is not trying to time the collapse, but rather positioning yourself to survive and thrive regardless of the macro environment. If currency debasement continues, and there's no evidence it will stop, your cash savings are losing value every single day. The dollars in your bank account buy less this year than last year, and they'll buy even less next year. This doesn't mean you should have zero cash. Liquidity is important for emergencies, but it does mean that holding large amounts of currency long-term is a guaranteed losing strategy. You need assets that hold value when currency doesn't. Historically, that's meant real estate, precious metals, productive businesses, and increasingly scarce digital assets. If debt becomes unsustainable and interest rates spike, which eventually they must when creditors lose confidence, variable rate debt becomes a death trap. Lock in fixed rate mortgages while they're still available at reasonable rates. Pay down high interest consumer debt aggressively. The era of cheap money is ending, and when interest rates normalize to historical levels, people drowning in variable debt will be wiped out. Conversely, if you can lock in fixed rate debt at today's rates and inflation continues, you're effectively being paid to borrow. This is one of the few times where strategic debt can be an advantage, but only if it's fixed rate and only if you're using it to acquire productive assets. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking that comparing America to 16th century Spain is absurd. We're a nuclear power, we have the world's reserve currency, we have Silicon Valley, and the most innovative companies on Earth. We have democratic institutions that Spain lacked. Surely the comparison breaks down when you account for these differences. Let me address this directly because it's a fair objection and it deserves a serious answer. Yes, America has advantages Spain never had. Our democratic system, for all its current dysfunction, is designed to allow for course correction in ways that Spanish monarchy couldn't. Our federal structure means that even if national politics are paralyzed, states can experiment with solutions. Our culture of entrepreneurship and innovation is stronger than anything Spain possessed. These are real advantages, and they might buy us time that Spain didn't have. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every empire in decline believes it's different. The Romans thought their system was superior to all predecessors. The Spanish thought their empire was divinely ordained and therefore permanent. The British thought the sun would never set on their dominion. They were all wrong because they all missed the fundamental lesson of history. The specific advantages that make you dominant change over time, but the patterns of decline remain constant. Currency debasement, debt, deindustrialization, social fragmentation, and talent drain have killed every empire that experienced all five simultaneously, regardless of how advanced or powerful they seemed at their peak. The reserve currency status that we think protects us is actually a vulnerability because it's allowed us to run deficits that would have bankrupted any other nation decades ago. So if the patterns are this clear and the trajectory is this ominous, what would it actually take to change course? This is where the analysis gets politically uncomfortable because the solutions that would work are politically impossible. In our current environment, which is itself proof of how far down the Spanish path we've already traveled. But let's talk about what would need to happen anyway, even if it's not going to happen. First, we would need to stabilize the currency by constraining the Federal Reserve's ability to create money at will. This means either returning to some form of commodity backing, which nobody in power wants, or imposing strict rules on money creation that are enforced by something other than the discretion of central bankers. Neither party supports this because both parties benefit from the ability to spend money they don't have. Until the pain of currency debasement becomes so severe that it overcomes political resistance, this won't change. Second, we would need to cut military spending by at least 30 to 40% and redirect those resources to infrastructure, education, and paying down debt. This is political suicide in America because we've convinced ourselves that any reduction in military spending means weakness and danger. Spain faced the same resistance. Their military spending bankrupted them, but every time a king tried to reduce it, the nobles and generals revolted. We're trapped in the same dynamic. Third, we would need to reindustrialize America through aggressive policies that bring manufacturing back home. This means tariffs, tax incentives for domestic production, and accepting that consumer goods will cost more in the short term, so we can have security and jobs in the long term. Some politicians talk about this, but the multinational corporations that fund both parties oppose it because their profits depend on global supply chains and cheap foreign labor. We've covered a lot of ground in this analysis, and I want to make sure you walk away with clarity rather than confusion. The 5 warning signs that destroyed Spain in 90 years are all flashing in America right now. Currency debasement is accelerating, not slowing. Debt is growing faster than the economy. Our industrial base continues to shrink. Social and political fragmentation is intensifying, and the talent drain is beginning. These aren't predictions, they're observable facts that anyone can verify. The question isn't whether we're following the Spanish pattern. The question is how far along that path we are and whether we have enough time to change course. My assessment, based on the historical parallels, is that we're past the point of easy solutions. We're in the phase where corrective action is still possible but politically unlikely because the decline itself makes collective action harder. This is the cruel paradox of imperial collapse. By the time it's obvious that you need to change, you've usually lost the capacity to do so. But here's what I want you to understand. Recognizing the pattern doesn't mean giving up. It means getting realistic about the challenges we face and making smart decisions based on that reality, rather than comfortable delusions. The people who thrive during transitions are those who see things clearly and adapt accordingly. The people who suffer are those who cling to the belief that the old normal will return if they just wait long enough. For those of you here at Financial Freedom Desk, this is exactly the kind of analysis we do, cutting through the noise, identifying the patterns that matter, and helping you make decisions based on reality rather than hope. The warning signs are flashing. The parallels to Spanish decline are undeniable. What you do with that information is up to you. You can dismiss it as doom and gloom,